And I'm Brooke Lavelle from the Courage of Care Coalition. We're a nonprofit dedicated to building a more just, compassionate world. And our team is involved in trainings to support folks in social service, in activist organizations, in caring professions to find ways of developing more relational compassion practices, anti-oppressive practices, healing and restorative tools and systems tools to respond more effectively to our world. And I'm joined tonight by my colleague and dear one, Zach Walsh. Do you want to introduce yourself, Zach?
Yeah, pleasure to be here. I'm Zach. I split my time here in Seattle, where we're calling from, and Berlin, where I work as a research associate for the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies. I work on a project. It's called A Mindset for the Anthropocene. You can find a website, ama-project.org. And we're focused on contemplative practice, spirituality, sort of the human dimensions of sustainability, and how shift in values and worldviews is implicated in the Great Transition, which we'll get to in a bit. But it's nice to be here. Thank you all for joining us, and hope to get to know you over the course of the night.
And Zach and I had a chance to collaborate institutionally over the last year in partnership with Courage and the ISS to co-develop this framework for folks working on or interested in working on addressing issues related to the eco-crisis. And we're going to be sharing some of the outcome of that work tonight with you, a bit about the framework, one or two practices that you can implement right away, and a pathway for helping you think about how you might stay engaged beyond this call. But before we get started, as folks are still settling in, we'd love to see who's on the call. And so we're going to open up the chat box and ask you to respond to some of the following questions. Let us know where you're calling in from and what's on your hearts and minds about the eco-crisis right now. Maybe it's one of your biggest challenges or worries right now, or something that you're curious to learn about tonight. And we're also really interested in, this is the work of Courage, not just lifting up what feels overwhelming or stressful, but what also keeps us going or motivated in the work right now. I see some folks calling in here from Nepal, from California, from the East Coast. Great all. Keep these responses coming. We'll keep checking the chat box. Before we jump into the framework, Zach is just going to give us a little picture of where things stand right now, a little framing.
Well, hello again. I'm sure some of this won't be new, but just to get us all in the same sort of mindset and the severity and some of the gravity of the issues that we're talking about, this is a graph of the Earth's temperature over its entire history. And to start, one of the contexts I like to think of the work in is the geological epoch that people now call the Anthropocene. Anthropos is a Greek word that means human, and it's labeled the human epoch because humans as a collective species have influence over planetary systems. And this is unique. So it changes how we understand humans in relationship to each other and to the Earth. And this graph right here is showing you how temperatures have changed recently in relation to the epoch where we had about 10,000 years of stability in the climate system. And that is a stability that allowed for human flourishing in terms of agricultural systems, settlements, civilization as we sort of know it. But we're fundamentally in a different period based on, you see on the far right, in 2050, we're expected to have about 2 degrees increase Celsius in global warming. And then potentially in 2100, about 4 degrees Celsius of global warming. So that's fundamentally a different climate system that we'll have to be living under. So civilization as we know it is going to have to adapt. This is a diagram of how to understand the evolution or adaptation of complex systems based on environmental pressures. And so the first accumulation phase on the left of the diagram basically describes in this situation how different social and environmental pressures, especially in the last 250 years, are contributing to a qualitatively different system. And the decision window where we're at now, I would say in the last 50 or so years, is as environmental and social pressures are increasing, the system cannot sustain in its current level of complexity unless we fundamentally reorganize that system. And this is following complex system science, so that at the chaos point, there's a bifurcation of the system and only 2 futures after that. One is either breakthrough path or a breakdown path. This is demonstrating something very similar, but from the point of view of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And these scenarios are looking at what is necessary in terms of reduction of carbon emissions to sustain global civilization. And so the bottom scenario, the purple, is what would have to happen for us to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So in order to limit to 1.5 degrees Celsius, IPCC is saying by 2030, we have to have global carbon emissions, and by 2050, we have to hit zero net emissions, which means that the amount of carbon we emit into the atmosphere has to be equivalent to the amount that we sequester through technology, soil, forestry, and what have you. Now, what's interesting also is that if you look at the two periods from about 1940-45 and 1990, there were roughly equivalent rates of decline in terms of carbon emissions, but those were at periods of crisis. So we're really looking at the scale of a crisis, because society is going to have to qualitatively change to limit emissions at such a fast rate. And so we're left with these two futures, the Great Transition and the Great Unraveling, coming from Joanna Macy's and others' work, where the Great Transition describes a positive potential of a sustainable future where society is fundamentally reorganized to sustain itself and sustain a higher quality of living. Whereas the Great Unraveling sort of describes that breakdown path, or in some cases, even a potential collapse of social structures.
And so we're so curious to hear from you all, and given this frame and given what you all know and are witnessing about the ecological crisis, where do you relate? Are you preparing more, you'd say, for the Great Transition? Are you readying us for the Great Unraveling? Or are you finding that you're holding both of those equally in mind and practice? Great. Seeing quite a few folks coming in at both. One folk on the Great Transition. So our work at Courage, like many of you are holding, is trying to hold center in a way and preparing us for both the Great Transition and the Great Unraveling as equal possibilities. And by that, we mean that we don't know what the future holds. We'd like to think that we are readying for the Great Transition, but we actually think both alternatives and both camps, if you will, folks who are readying for the Great Transition and folks readying for the Great Unraveling or Great Collapse, are both rooted in care. Both of us, both groups are calling us in to embrace each other and do whatever we can to reduce the impact of the climate crisis and to protect each other along the way. And we take inspiration from the work of Rebecca Solnit, and this is an excerpt from an article she wrote in The Guardian based on her book, Hope in the Dark. And we see hope not as some flighty quality or characteristic, but actually as spiritual practice. And this is how we're orienting ourselves to the work of climate justice. Hope locates itself in the premises that we don't know what will happen, and that in the spaciousness of uncertainty is room to act. When you recognize uncertainty, you recognize that you may be able to influence the outcomes, you alone or you in concert with a few dozen or several million others. Hope is an embrace of the unknown and the unknowable, an alternative to the certainty of both optimists and pessimists. Optimists think we'll all be fine without our involvement. Pessimists adopt the opposite position. Both excuse themselves from acting. It's the belief that what we do matters, even though how and when it may matter, who and what it may impact, are not things we can know beforehand. We may not know them afterwards either, but they matter all the same. And history is full of folks whose influence was most powerful after they were gone. So the work we've collaborated on between Courage and the ISS, as part of that, we developed a framework for addressing and preparing folks to understand both the complexities of the climate crisis and also to learn tools to stay ever more responsive and engaged. The relational frame draws on the 5 modules of the Courage Blueprint, and it starts with love, or the sense of helping us learn to ground deeply in our sense of relationality, interconnection, and care as the foundation for all the work we do, no matter the future. As we deepen our capacity for relationality, connection, and care, we move into the module called C, in which we collectively investigate the deep, complex causes of the climate crisis and ways in which we need to understand the complexities that we're responding to. As we surface up some of those complexities, we move into a module called Heal, in which we begin to address some of the stress, some of the despair, hopelessness that I heard some of you all mention, the ways in which we maybe check out, and also sets of practices that help us learn to repair, to restore, and even move into regenerative practices. And then we move into our vision module, which is helping us sense that we want to move from just fixing what's broken, but also envisioning what else could be, and begin to act or enact or embody practices and communities of practice that help us live into a more sustainable and just future for all. Each of those modules is grounded in what we call 3 modes of knowing, being, and doing. In other words, it's not enough to just know about the eco crisis, but part of our responsiveness requires that we learn new ways of being together and being in relationship with our world, and new ways of acting or responding. And that's woven through the framework. So to start with love, when we think of love, we use the words care and compassion interchangeably, and we think of them as stances, as motivational stances, or as ethics. It's really about helping us learn to reclaim our sense of deep connection and learning to see ourselves actually as part of the world. I was reading earlier today, or rereading, Braiding Sweetgrass, a really beautiful book that I highly recommend to all of you, by Robin Wall Kimmerer. And in it she writes, "Knowing that you love the earth changes you, activates you to defend and protect and celebrate. But when you feel the earth loves you in return, that feeling transforms the relationship from a one-way street into a sacred bond." And I'd love to invite us right in this moment into just a practice of sensing into the meaning behind that quote. And if you're not seated or comfortable already, I'm going to invite you to take a seat. Feel your feet on the ground or your sit bones on the chair or cushion. And taking a few slow, deep breaths, allowing yourself to settle, relax, release just a bit more into the support of the chair or the earth beneath your feet with each out breath. And as we settle into this seat, seeing if we can connect into our relationship with the earth literally beneath our feet. Trusting, sensing that we are held, supported by the earth beneath our feet. Aware of the ways we know or don't know, the ways in which this land has supported, nourished, nurtured us. The beings, communities, people who have lived on this land. Our nearest water source that sustains and nourishes us. And as we become more aware of the sense of groundedness beneath our feet, seeing if we can explore allowing the energy to move out beneath our feet into the ground beneath us, almost as if we're settling into, rooting into the ground beneath our feet. And as we become more aware of our sense of self in relationship to place, see if we can become more aware of ourself in relationship to time. Here too, again, reflecting on the many beings, humans, plants, animals that have lived on this land before us. All of those in our own lineage, our ancestral lineage, our spiritual lineage, that have walked this land before us. Sensing those literally at our back. And aware too of the many generations that will come after us, the many beings that will also hopefully walk this land after us. Sensing ourselves actually in that lineage of time, of creation. And aware too of our sense of self in space. Seeing if we can feel more into the environment around us, maybe softening or releasing that sense of self, of me and the world outside. And maybe that involves just softening the body a little more, sensing into the beings in your home, or taking a gentle glance out the window and seeing if you can sense that nature, the world is not so much out there, but we are already in it and part of it. And the direction of love or care, relationality in this way is to help us soften this sense of boundary or boundedness. Help us sense that deeper sense of connection, interbeing. And as we bring this practice to a close, see if you can allow some of that feeling of that practice to continue to resonate through the rest of our time together. Thank you.
So as Brooke mentioned, Courage of Care and this curriculum that we've developed also with the ISS is fundamentally based on a relational way of being in the world, a relational way of thinking each other in connection to Earth systems, to non-humans. And we recognize that although this is not new by any means, it is distinctly different than the sort of modern Western paradigm of thinking in terms of mechanism, of linear causal relationships between entities or beings and external but not internal relationship to each other. From the modern Western point of view, in the early 20th century, there was an alternative ecological paradigm or systems view that understood fundamentally everything in relationship to each other. This was born out of insights like quantum physics, ecological system and earth sciences, and it understood that everything is systems within systems within systems, whether we talk about economic or political systems, planetary systems, my body as a system, communities as systems, that these things are fundamentally related to each other and that there are relationships that are interacting at multiple levels of hierarchy, both top-down and bottom-up. When we think of the sustainability crisis from this much more relational and situated point of view, we need to understand how both social and ecological crises are fundamentally interconnected so that we can, for instance, piece together news stories that may be discussing large-scale migration and social instability in relationship to climate change mitigation and adaptation. The good news is that the solutions, not only the problems, are interconnected, so that if we work on, say, poverty alleviation or gender equality, we're also making headway in other dimensions, like climate action or responsible consumption, so that we can understand the synergies between the different problems in ways that allow for catalytic solutions to these problems. In the second module, we look at the sort of deeper roots of the eco-crisis in terms of systems of oppression and domination. One of the most prominent being capitalism. If you look at the graph here on the screen, this is the Great Acceleration. And although the Anthropocene is the human epoch, we recognize that humans aren't collectively accountable in the same way across the board, that actually there are systems of unequal distribution, of hierarchy, of domination that are underneath the actual social and ecological crises that are converging at this moment. And so one other way to think of this is the capitalist scene, as Jason Moore, an environmental historian, has called it, because capital, or the system of capitalism, is actually really responsible for the indicators on the right, which are environmental degradation indicators. So pollution of air, water, and soil, for instance, is intimately related to an increase in economic activity. Also important to understand that as capitalism became globalized, it was intimately linked with colonialism because it saw not only humans, but also non-humans as resources, as objects of exploitation. So as capitalism coincides with the sort of enclosure of the commons and the privatization of the commons, then it also takes humans and non-humans, land as resources, and exploits them. And this is a diagram just of one historical example of the transatlantic slave trade, where Africans were taken to the Americas for production of cotton, sugar, and what have you, to essentially accelerate the development of capitalism. This system is also protected by military and state violence, whether domestically or internationally through imperialistic incursions in other nations for resources, for oil, or again, through police violence, police brutality. All of this we're still witnessing, but is also intimately intertwined with the social and ecological crisis and the development of capitalism over its entire history. And finally, there are these various ways of othering, of understanding life as less meaningful, less worthy, less valuable, whether it's through patriarchy and the domination of men over women, rationality over sort of intuition, or white supremacy, white bodies dominant over people of color, indigenous people, or humans over non-humans. That these things actually are also intimately related, and we need to understand them as intersectional crises. So I sort of created this infographic to put all of these different systems of domination in relationship to systems of potential liberation, so that we can just really quickly understand that state violence, white supremacy, colonialism, humanism, or Enlightenment humanism as human exceptionalism, capitalism, and patriarchy are systems of domination underneath social and eco crises, but that there are potential antidotes or alternative systems or ways of being in relationship to each other. And these could be, for instance, direct democracy, racial justice, gender justice, eco-socialism, post-humanism, and decolonization. That these are really at the cutting edge of a lot of our social and ecological movements and are building a better future, or what we call the Great Transition.
And I heard a number of us during the check-in raise up concerns around overwhelm, despair, hopelessness, and it's not hard to imagine why some of us might feel some of those feelings, especially as we start to look under the hood or peel back the curtain and investigate some of the complex causes of the climate crisis, not to mention many of the other crises and traumas of our time that Zach just lifted up. And many people have already been writing about the climate crisis as a cultural trauma or as a social trauma. And it's not uncommon for many folks to feel anxiety, depression, symptoms of PTSD, grief, anger, depression, and so on. In reading about it, encountering it, knowing folks directly impacted, although we're all impacted, but especially folks in our most vulnerable communities right now experiencing some of the biggest brunt of the climate crisis. So our work at Courage is helping us understand not only our natural response to this, how normal it is actually to have some of these feelings in response to understanding more about the climate crisis, but also for giving us tools to help us stay even more engaged in the work so that we don't tune out, check out, feel overwhelmed, but that in a sense we learn to resource ourselves enough to stay involved. And while I mentioned that all of these responses, the responses of anger, of rage, of frustration, of anxiety, fear, dissociation are all really normal, part of our investigation is looking at ways in which we might almost get stuck with the on switch on in some of these stress responses. That over time we might notice that we developed habitual ways of responding to or habitual ways of not responding or checking out to the climate crisis. So some of us might notice that all we can seem to do is be upset, pissed off, angry at the crisis. We take in and consume all the information we can get about the crisis. We attend every eco meeting, we attend every eco protest, and our nervous systems are turned on, right? And some of us might find ourselves caught in what we might think of as fight response. Others of us might cope or respond by finding ourselves caught in like anxiety or fear or needing to check out in ways like tuning out, turning off the news, pretending in some way that it's all going to be fine. Again, as a wise coping strategy to protect the body. But if we get caught in this stress response also can inhibit our capacity to respond in really effective ways. And others of us might find ourselves kind of giving over to or being caught in a stress response that looks more like depression or numbness or feelings of helplessness. And that might feel a little bit more like freeze in the body, a sense that we can't really do anything. We might feel immobilized. We're kind of like caught and overwhelmed by all of the data, all the information that Zach just shared, and figuring like, what could I even do about this? So again, all of these are super normal processes. But I want to invite us to consider what are some of the dominant stress shapes that we find ourselves in. And I'm going to ask us to just go to the chat box and say, if you can think about your primary shape or your primary response in regards to the climate shape. Do you find yourself day in and day out a little bit more caught in fight, flight, or freeze? Many of us circle through all of these, but where would you say you land these days? Some folks in freeze. A lot of freeze coming in. Yep. Yeah, freeze but fluctuates, totally. Yes, Cara, fight but really fight and freeze. Yes. Freeze. Yes. Yeah, so this makes really good sense, right? And we can imagine that if many of us who showed up to this call already with a deep interest, I'm assuming in the work, feeling ourselves caught in freeze, imagine what's also happening on a broader level, on a cultural level. And some writers, like Charles Eisenstein and others, have been writing about the ways in which culturally, and I know there are many cultures, but speaking about certain aspects of American culture, that we're caught in like a collective freeze state. And so let's think about the ways that that might be inhibiting or limiting our response. And so what do we do about it? So I'm going to offer us one way of starting to get in touch with a little bit of this process. And this is a way of simply dropping in and learning to become a little bit more present to those feelings themselves. So again, just finding a way to settle in just a little bit so the body feels a bit of support. And we'll just drop our attention or awareness into the feeling of the body. So we're not thinking about the body right now, but we're feeling it from within. And maybe it'll help you once again to feel your feet on the floor, your sit bones on the floor, or the feeling of your hands resting on your thighs or in your lap. And maybe taking a moment to do a really gentle scan of the body, moving from the soles of the feet through the calves, up through the kneecaps and the thighs, up through the torso, the arms, the neck, head, shoulders. Just getting a sense of what's happening, what's alive in the body. Aware maybe of any sensations in the body, like feelings of temperature, circulation, digestion, respiration. And just noticing. And so our first step in just dealing or presencing is learning to just be with what's here. Develop a kind of capacity and even a courage to be with what's here. And then tuning into whatever emotional feeling feels salient right now in our field of awareness. And this might be a feeling of overwhelm or a feeling of anxiety, or a feeling of anger, despair. Or in this moment, there might be a feeling of ease or joy. So whatever's here, we practice with. And taking a moment to feel that feeling from within the body to whatever degree you can right now. So not trying to think about the feeling, but Feel what that feels like, what the world looks and feels like from within that feeling. What does the gut feel like? What does the chest feel like? What does the body feel like from within that feeling? And if it's a challenging feeling or a stressful feeling, trying just for a few moments not to fix or change or figure out or repress. We're developing a capacity or habit to simply be with what's here, to really try to understand that response. To know that there's some wisdom here too. And sometimes when we get caught in these stress responses, our whole mind and body can be kind of taken up or taken over by this feeling. And as we build this capacity of presence, we're learning to find just a little bit more space, just a little bit more freedom kind of around or even within that feeling. That this feeling is not the only reality here, it's not the only possibility here. And by just bringing attention to that feeling, you might already feel a little bit more space, a little bit more room. Or you might notice that it's helpful also to ground a little bit around this feeling, to feel your feet on the floor, that sense of rootedness, to reconnect with that sense of lineage, that sense of community, that feeling that there are others with us, also willing to hold this, to see this with us, to respond to this with us. This is a practice we can repeat over time. For now, I'll invite us to let this feeling fade and to bring our attention back to the feeling of our breath as it enters and leaves our body. And as we bring the practice to a close, taking a moment to notice what, if any, feelings or effects came through that practice. And similarly, exploring letting those qualities continue to resonate. I want to say that this presencing practice is just a step in the process. And in this short time together, we want to introduce kind of a step one in a way. But presencing or settling or grounding in and of itself is just one step in the healing process. And Resmaa Menakem, who's written this beautiful book, My Grandmother's Hands, writes about the distinction between settling and healing. I also highly recommend this book. Settling, he writes, is not the same as healing. It's an important foundation for it. A settled body invites and accepts efforts to mend it. An unsettled one tends to resist those efforts. He goes on to say that unfortunately, sometimes we learn to settle actually as ways of distracting or just coping to really avoid healing. But the invitation and practices of presencing as a first step are helping us really get in touch with those patterns, those difficult feelings that many, if not all of us, face in response to this, to develop the courage to show up for them, and then to find a little more space where we can really begin to work to actually heal, re-regulate our nervous system, develop a capacity of responsiveness that can help us begin to transform. These systems of oppression that Zach talked about find themselves within our bodies, albeit in different ways. We're affected by the systems within which we live in different ways. And yet, nevertheless, by beginning to work on, to heal, to find more space in our bodies, we can begin to find works of finding more space and more creative responsiveness, not only in our relationships, but in our organizations and in the work as a whole. And this is why one of the complements or directions of practice for this is beginning to understand how the traumas and challenges of the climate crisis also live in our bodies. We want to move from just healing to also envisioning and to seeing not just what's broken or needs to be fixed or what's challenging, but also what could be.
Thank you, Brooke. And at this point, we're really also orienting ourselves to the great transition and the positive potentials, not just in the future, but also already here. How those can be modeled, how those can be lived in community. And so we draw especially encourage from speculative traditions and creative arts-based traditions like science fiction, world building, and what have you. And in particular, we're interested in centering marginalized voices within these. So we're really looking at, for instance, indigenous futurism, which explores decolonized futures or what a future without colonization would look like. And this is one book, just for example, that discusses how the No DAPL movement and the Standing Rock social movement actually use indigenous futurism within the community to invigorate the people there, and how actually the way that they organized community represented a different paradigm itself, and how that they lived into that, and how also indigenous science, not Western science, for instance, could orient the future in a different way. She also talks about, for example, water rights and how different cosmologies, different ways of understanding water, the land as persons, also orients us to a different future. Another tradition we really are interested in is Afrofuturism, and that centers Black liberation and Black voices within science fiction. And this is a movie called Pumzi, which came out in 2009. It's a Kenyan film, and it's a climate dystopia in Africa where everything is desert and there's practically no life. And what happens over the course of this film is this character who's pictured here actually finds the seed for new life. And so it's sort of a 20-minute short film you can watch on Vimeo that chronicles her journey as basically slave labor within the society, a sort of climate dystopia, and tries to create a new alternative positive future. And lastly, there's a burgeoning sort of movement in speculative fiction called solar punk, which has only been out for a little bit more than 5 years, but which has predecessors, which I've listed on the bottom, like The Dispossessed from Ursula Le Guin and Starhawk's The Fifth Sacred Thing, Kim Stanley Robinson's The Green Earth, where the focus here is on futures of sustainability and justice. And so they're providing an optimistic version of the future, unlike a lot of the dystopians we see in film and media, which are really interesting. And one that I would just give an example of is Ecotopia in the sort of top left, which is one of the earliest versions of this genre about 45 years ago. The author writes from the perspective of a journalist who's visiting a society that is fundamentally changed for justice and sustainability. And he talks about how they use energy, how they have figured out new eco-agricultural systems, how they live in community based on cooperative commonwealth, different ways of organizing. So it's just interesting to explore these futures and then to sort of make them into new realities. And that brings us to ACT. How are these new visions, these new ways of relating and being actually also here and in our social movements, and how could they become more actualized or realized? And there are three sort of general ways to think about this, which are pretty common. One is reforming existing systems, working within to transform, or resisting, sort of blocking actions, what Joanna Macy would call, or rebuilding alternatives. So really looking at alternative paradigms and alternative systems. And these three logics of transformation are all useful in different circumstances, depending on what's strategic, where the leverage points are, and which systems are evolving in which ways. So Eric Olin Wright, the book on the left, sort of explores these three different logics of transformation as they're working together. But if we look specifically at the sustainability movement, we already see this, for instance, in the Green New Deal, which is caught on since last year in AOC, her proposal for a Green New Deal, which really uses, for the first time in a major effort, the language of environmental justice and centering marginalized communities in a complete infrastructure overhaul, moving towards renewable energy, looking at alternative systems. So using the government and state power in an effective way to create a sustainability transition. And also, even just a few weeks ago, the EU released a plan of trillions of dollars, they say. The details have yet to be worked out, but for their own Green New Deal. So this is really catching on, it's catching fire, and it's a positive potential of reform. We also have a global eco-justice movement, and if you wanted to explore geographically where this is happening and how, you can check out this great website called the Environmental Justice Atlas, where they have cataloged different stories of eco-activism around the world, and linked to articles and what have you. So this is a global phenomenon that's happening and that we can all contribute to in different ways. And finally, rebuilding, there's many movements of radical municipalism. This one on the left is called Barcelona en Comú, which is sort of a political party in Barcelona that is working with the commons to fundamentally change social provisioning, social systems based on reciprocity, based on commonwealth, rather than privatization of property and resources. The one on the right is somewhat similar, but comes from Jackson, Mississippi, in which disenfranchised and marginalized Black communities in that area that had been impoverished really came together and created alternative economic democracies where they created power within those communities to be reliant in the face of disaster and in the face of marginalization. So they've created commons-based systems. They have an eco-village that is developing. They're looking at alternative currencies. They're sort of doing many different things to weather the storm, as it were.
Lots to learn and lots of things to do and ways to respond. As we move into our ACT approach, what we really offer, and it depends a lot on the communities with which we're working, the locations with which we're working, the professions, and so on. So what we've offered tonight is some principles that we like to use for transformative action that we can use to maybe help guide action or communities we might want to be part of, or to help us reflect on the work that we're already engaged in. And some questions for us to consider in regards to our climate responsiveness is, does the work bring us back into relationality? Is there some fundamental sense that rerouting in relationship is actually at the core of the work? Or does the project itself reproduce fundamental sorts of dualisms, and that could be a guide for us? Another important question to ask is, the work that we're doing fundamentally anti-oppressive? Does it work to address systems of oppression, capitalism, white supremacy, and so on? Or does it in its own way actually continue to reproduce those systems, even maybe unconsciously? Is the approach restorative? Is it working to restore relationships with people, with the planet, rather than punitive? Is it really calling all of us in and working to build a beloved community for all? Or is it a process that's really lifting up or supporting the likes and needs of a few? Is it radical? Is the vision working to change the system, or is it business as usual in a way? And does it build a culture of practice? And this is something we're really keen on within Courage, is to helping us think about how we build communities and cultures of practice, not just that know the facts about what's happening with the eco-crisis, but that we're in communities where we're practicing together, building relationship, understanding what's needed within our community, learning tools to heal and grow together, and building a vision that makes sense for each of us. So I want to invite you all, as this is coming alive, we recognize that some of you are already deeply involved in the work. If you want to add some things in the chat box, some links that you want to make sure folks on this call get to hear or get to know about, we're also going to send out a bibliography after this call and this webinar for those of you here. But if you also have ideas or questions about communities of practice that you want to make sure get in there, go ahead and get those in the chat box. I will say before we open it up for a dialogue that Zach and I created an online course called Securing Our Future, Responding with Love to a Civilization in Crisis. This is a 5-module course with multiple teachings, lessons, practices, reflections, and extensive bibliography for those of you who love that kind of stuff. And it's a self-paced course that you can do on your own time at any time for those of you that want to just go a little bit deeper in the work. We've also piloted this project with a number of universities, and I thought I'd mention that because we have a number of higher ed folks on the course. So those of you that are teaching this work, that are looking for more material to integrate into your class, or for those of you that want to collaborate in some way, we recently launched a kind of informal collaborative with folks from universities and research institutes across the US and Europe as of right now. And we're working to build a sharing resource guide where we continue to work on these curriculums, share resources, share practices, and build our own kind of community of practice around that. So please do feel free to just reach out, let us know where you're up to and how you might want to get involved if that's of interest to you. And we're always available after this for follow-up questions, but we have about 8 or 9 minutes left. And so we wanted to invite you all, feel free to type a question in the chat box, feel free to unmute yourself, say hello. Zach can close out the screen, and then I think we actually might get to see some faces here, those of you who want to. Okay, y'all. I know some of you were coming to a webinar and you weren't expecting to talk, so that's just fine. But again, we'll share out with you all what we discussed, and we'll share our contact info so you'll be able to reach out to us. And we're happy and eager to hear from you, what else is going on, what else we need to learn about and be thinking about. And if there's any way we can support you in your work, please do let us know. We really appreciate you taking time late on a Thursday night or really early on Friday morning in Kathmandu to be with us and to kind of come together and practice with you all for that. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah. Good to see you guys.
Yeah. Good night, everyone. Good morning. Yeah.